Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the rise of democracy. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to see how archaic Greece produces maybe the biggest influence on the world today. And that, of course, is democracy. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by setting the scene contextually. We are going to talk a little bit about the ancient Greek polis, right? The city-state in ancient Greece. Then we're going to talk a little bit about a tale of two cities. And those two cities, of course, are, you guessed it, Athens and Sparta. And then finally, we'll see how within one of those cities, we get the emergence of this form of government that we still like to think that we use today. So let's go ahead and set the scene. Remember, it all begins in the Bronze Age, somewhere around 5,000 years ago, 3000 BC, this period where we get the rise of complexity with things like monumental architecture and social and economic hierarchies. Now, when that falls apart, we get Greece devolving into what we call the Dark Ages, right? Where we lose that complexity, we lose that sophistication in terms of material culture and social and economic structures. But that all starts to change in the 8th century BC. Remember that 8th century Renaissance. And this archaic period is when we actually get the emergence of all those things that we go on to associate with classical Greece, right? All those things, all the reasons we think Greece is important, those tend to start during the archaic period. And so what we end up seeing is we see all kinds of things start then. We see hoplite and phalanx warfare. We end up seeing philosophy that's asking why the world works the way it does. Let's try to explain things without just assuming the gods did everything. We start to get religious architecture that's in the form that we think of today, right? Those giant stone temples with colonnades all around. We get pottery in that kind of black figure Athenian form. And we get Greeks starting to try to depict the body in life-size stone sculpture. So all these things, while they continue to evolve in the classical period, they all begin in the archaic. So, in order to understand the emergence of democracy in the ancient Greek world, we first have to understand what we call the ancient Greek polis. And polis is the Greek term for city-state. Now, what we have to remember, right, is that ancient Greece does not equal modern Greece, all right? And what this ends up meaning is that modern Greece is a country, right? It's ruled by a capital in Athens, right? And it has this very delineated territory right around the outside. So you can put exact boundaries on modern Greece. We know the capital city of this. It's a country, right? Now, when we look at the ancient Greek world, what we get is a collection, right? A conglomeration of city-states. And so here's a kind of map of different city-states, the red ones kind of being in the Greek homeland, right around here, right? Mainland Greece, the island of Crete, western Turkey. And then all these black ones are different colonies that sprung up during the archaic period. And while all of these share certain characteristics, and we'll talk about what those characteristics are in a second, they're all independent politically. So they make their own laws, they make their own coins, they have their own rulers. And that also means that they compete with each other, right? They fight with each other, they try to compete with each other for prestige, that sort of thing. Now, let's go ahead and think about what are the things that make Greece, Greece, right? Like what are the things that make Greeks, Greeks? If they have different governments and if they're independent laws and coinage and things like that, what is it that kind of ties them all together? So part of it is the language, right? They're all speaking and writing the same kind of language. They're all speaking Greek, right? Part of it is a series of cultural values, right? The idea of sports, people participating from all over the Greek world in things like the Olympics. They share a style of warfare. So this idea of phalanx warfare becomes common across most of the Greek city-states. They share a sense of material culture as well, right? So they have slightly different forms of pottery, things like that. But the idea of the Greek temple, right, is something that goes across all of these city-states. And then other cultural values, things like drinking wine, having olive oil, that sort of thing, that spreads across all the different city-states. So these kind of cultural values are what tie all these Greek city-states together. Now, when we look at the polis itself, all right, it's composed of essentially kind of three different areas, all right? So we end up at the very, very heart of things. In most Greek city-states, we get what we call an acropolis, right? The high city, right? It's literally the high part of the city, acro meaning high, polis meaning city. Below that, we get what we call the asti, all right? And the asti is the rest of the urban part of the city itself, all right? So down below the acropolis, but still part of the urban fabric of the city. And then finally, we get what's known as the chora, all right? And the chora is the surrounding countryside. This is where the farming is. And so when we think of a polis, it's all three parts of these together, right? It's the very, very center of the city on top of the hill. It's the city, the urban city below that, and it's the countryside. And you take all those together, and that makes up a polis. Now, let's refresh our idea on ancient Greek governments. So we talk a little bit about how power in the ancient Greek world slowly moves from very strong and centralized during the Bronze Age to a little bit less kind of powerful, but still fairly centralized in the Dark Ages with the basileis as the kings, towards oligarchy in the Archaic period. Now, just to differentiate these terms, right? A monarchy is single rule, right? Ruled by a single individual, where that power is inherited from generation to generation. That's very different from oligarchy, where it's a small group of aristocrats, more than one person who's ruling at a given time. Those both differ from tyranny, which is also ruled by a single individual. But the difference here, right? The difference between tyranny and monarchy, in tyranny, it's a single individual who seized power, all right? And so the way that this tends to work is that it starts as an oligarchy. You get a single person within that oligarchy who's got plans to take over, and then eventually they kick out the rest of the oligarchs, and there you have a tyrant ruling in a tyrannical form of government. And then finally, what we end up with is democracy, which is ruled by the people. All right, and so let's talk now about a tale of two cities. And those, of course, are Athens and Sparta. And let's go ahead and start with warrior like Sparta. So, when we talk about Sparta, we're talking about a city-state in the Peloponnese. The Peloponnese is this giant peninsula down in the southwestern part of Greece, very, very mountainous in general. A lot of the regions, even though it looks connected, divided by different mountain ranges. And Sparta is down here in the southern part in the region we call Laconia. Now, when we talk about Sparta, the history of Sparta only goes back to the Dark Ages, around 1000 BC, so it doesn't have a Bronze Age settlement associated with it. We do have evidence for two different settlements, both by the Acropolis, right, the high part of the city. And we think that we get the government associated with Sparta from the unification of those two settlements. And so when we think about Spartan government, what we have is we have a dual monarchy, right? There are always two kings ruling in Sparta, and we think that that may be the result of these two kind of different settlements merging together and having one representative from each of the settlements. Now, when we talk about kind of the characteristics that make Sparta Sparta, right? The things that we really associate with that city-state, a lot of it goes back to their historical, kind of mythical leader, this guy by the name of Lycurgus, all right? And we don't know whether Lycurgus was a real guy or not. His name kind of means wolf, right? You could think of him as the Wolf of Sparta. What we do have is we have biographies of this guy, whether or not he was real or not. And he instituted a number of these kind of cultural and political and judicial institutions in Sparta that ended up having a very lasting impact and came to be associated with the Spartan way of life. So the first one of these has one of the best names here, right? The homoioi, right? And the homoioi is basically the idea that all Spartan men had equal status. And not only did they have equal status politically, they were actually given the same amount of land. So there's an economic equality that gets built into the idea of social and political equality as well. Now, we also have the development of what we call the Gerousia. All right, and the Gerousia is the Council of Elders. There are 28 of them. And this idea is that these Council of Elders held power that was equal to that of the two monarchs. So it's kind of a series of balance of power, right? Where the council balances out the monarchy. They decide when the votes are taken, and then all the people, right, all the homoioi, get to vote on those issues. We also get the development of pelonors. And this is this form of iron currency. So to discourage greed, right, in the Spartan population, Lycurgus comes up with this idea that they are going to use iron weights as the form of currency. And this means that you have to have massive, super heavy amounts of iron to really make anything worth anything. We have no gold and silver at all. And this is, again, to get at the Spartan way of life, where you're not pursuing material gain, you're pursuing the best interests of the city-state. Another part to it is the syssitia, and the syssitia are these eating groups. And so once you become an adult male, you're in one of these groups of 15 people. Everybody contributes food to the group. You eat together every night. And this builds these kind of bonds of brotherhood, right, amongst the men of the city. And then finally we get the agoge. And the agoge is this military training for young men. It starts at age 7, right? They're sent out into the wilderness. They have to survive on their own. And this is the beginning of this Spartan-style military training that made them such feared warriors in combat. So what ends up happening during the Archaic period in Sparta is that after Lycurgus takes over, and if he was alive, it was sometime in the kind of 8th century BC, Sparta then slowly begins to expand its power. So we can see they start in their own region of Laconia, but the first area they take over in the late 8th century or early 7th century is this area of Messenia. And after conquering Messenia, they basically enslave a huge portion of the population. And we call those slaves helots. And what Sparta ends up doing is taking the helots back to their homeland here, and they end up attaching them to the land itself. So the state owns the slaves. It's not individuals who own the slaves. And the slaves are attached to the land. So if somehow you buy your neighbor's land, it comes with the slaves. The slaves are attached to the land there. And then slowly after that, after taking over Messenia by force, Sparta continues to expand its power throughout the Peloponnese, this time diplomatically. And so they form something called the Peloponnesian League, of which Sparta is the head, and they start allying themselves with city-states like Corinth and Megara and Elis up near Olympia. By the 5th century, right, by the beginning of the 5th century, somewhere around 500 BC, without a doubt, Sparta is the strongest city-state in Greece. So what's going on in Athens at this time? So first things first, let's go ahead and situate ourselves geographically. When we see Sparta down here, right, this thing is the Peloponnese, Sparta is right down here, and then Athens is up here on the peninsula of Attica, all right? So the Attica Peninsula, and Athens is down there near the southeastern part of it. All right, and Athens is actually having quite a few problems during the Archaic period, especially early on in the 7th century. And those problems arise from things actually kind of going too well in a weird kind of way. So things are going well economically, and that means the population is growing. But unlike other city-states, Athens doesn't send people out to found new colonies. They don't have an outlet for this growing population. And what that means is that there's kind of a food shortage, and people need to start borrowing money and borrowing food from those kind of wealthier segments of Athenian population. And what happens then is that they get into this problem where they can't pay back what they owe. And early on in the 7th century, that basically meant that you became a slave for the person that you owed money to until you could work off your debts. But when you were working for them, you weren't making any money, so you actually never got to pay off your debts, and you end up with this issue that we call debt bondage. And this becomes a serious problem in the 7th century BC. Now, it becomes a big enough problem that we actually start to see revolts. And so we get this one guy by the name of CYLON in 632 BC, who basically gathers a bunch of people together. He was a really popular guy because he was a former victor in the Olympics, and he tries to take over the city. Now, the Athenians are able to prevent him from doing that, but the result is pretty morbid. So what ends up happening is that they know they're going to be defeated. They take refuge in the temple of Athena. basically this safe space. If you're in the temple, they can't kill you, that sort of thing. And it ends up that CYLON, the leader, actually gets away. But when the other guys leave the temple, presumably under the agreement that their lives would be spared, they would be punished, but their lives would be spared, it ends up that the rulers of Athens at the time end up massacring everybody. And what you're actually looking at here is they found this kind of mass grave not too long ago in Athens with people shackled together dating back to the late 7th century BC. And we think this might actually be the remains of this massacre. Now, the result of this was kind of something that will actually have repercussions 100-something years later. And what ends up happening is the ruling people in Athens at the time actually get cursed, right? So one of the ruling families was known as the Alcmaeonids. And one of the Alcmaeonids was the guy who ended up causing the massacre here. And their family is cursed with something that doesn't just affect the one guy here, but it goes through the generations. It's one of these things where the curse sticks with the family even after this guy dies. And we'll see what happens with the Alcmaeonids in the rise of democracy in just a little bit. So that coup fails, right? CYLON is freed, but the rest of his people are killed. About 10 years later, in 621, we get the first Athenian legislator, a guy by the name of DRACO. And DRACO's kind of claim to fame is he inputs the first set of laws that are written down in Athens. So before this, it was kind of an oral system of law. There was kind of blood feuds between families, that sort of thing. DRACO says, we're going to put laws on paper. And that sounds really good. That's actually a great thing to have in a society. The problem is, he's way too harsh with what his laws actually are. So if you've ever heard of draconian laws, right, or somebody being draconian, it's a synonym for being extra harsh. And what DRACO ends up doing is he basically makes the penalty for anything death, right? Steal from your friend, you're dead, right? You don't pay your taxes, you're dead. You do anything, you're dead. And so obviously this isn't a particularly good way of writing a law code, even though the idea of the law, of writing a law code itself is a pretty good one. So those don't last and they have to get rid of DRACO. Now, the first reformer to actually have his ideas catch on here is a guy by the name of Solon. And he sets in process this series of reforms in the early 6th century BC that we could think of as something like kind of proto-democracy. And the idea here is that he's going to get rid of debt bondage, right? So he says, first of all, everybody's got ownership of their own body. Second of all, anybody who's currently in debt bondage, they're freed. Third of all, let's go ahead and redistribute the land so that these people who are freed can actually make a living. Give them some land so that they can make a living. And we're going to go ahead and cancel their debts as well so that they don't get back into bondage. And then finally, he bans the export of grain. And the idea there is he wants to have that grain kept for Athenians. And so he sets in process these reforms, and he ends up kind of building a new form of government that has some inklings of kind of democracy. What he does is he breaks down the population into 4 wealth classes, right? So 4 census classes based on wealth. He also puts together something called the Areopagus. And the Areopagus here, this is a judicial committee. And it was only the wealthy people who could be part of that judicial committee. But then he also has a council of 400. And the Council of 400 is made up of all the different census classes, right? So people of all different kind of modes of wealth. And these are the people who end up setting the agenda for the votes, right? And it's all the citizens who could end up voting. So this sounds pretty much like democracy. The only problem is, even though it works for a little bit, is that it doesn't really catch on. Fairly soon, Solon's overthrown, and he's replaced by a tyrant, this guy PEISISTRATUS. And he's like kind of the tyrant of 6th century Athens. So even though Solon's ideas were really, really good, they don't really last. Now, one of the weird things about PEISISTRATUS is he's kind of into and out of power the whole time, right? So he kind of takes over, and then he gets kicked out of the city. and then he comes back into the city, and he actually says that his life was threatened at one point, and because his life was threatened, the Athenians allow him to have kind of an armed bodyguard, and then he uses that armed bodyguard to basically take over the city. But one of the weird things is that people like this guy. Things are going well economically during Peisistratus's kind of tyrannical rule in Athens, and when things go well economically, people tend to be happy. So, when Peisistratus dies, he leaves kind of his power to his sons, two guys by the name of Hippias and Hipparchus. And so they're kind of co-tyrants during the latter half of the 6th century BC. And what you're looking at here is a very famous sculpture known as the Tyrannicides. And the Tyrannicides are two men by the name of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, Harmodius being the old bearded dude, and Aristogeiton being the young, clean-shaven fellow here. And they were two lovers in ancient Greece, ancient Athens. And they're the ones who are going to make an attempt on the lives of Hippias and Hipparchus, the kind of dual tyrants of Athens. Now, it would be nice to think that this arises out of some like kind of noble cause, right? Some kind of yearning for democracy. But that's not really the case. It actually happens because of a lover's quarrel. So the younger brother of Hippias and Hipparchus, a guy by the name of Phetelos, is in love with Harmodius. But Harmodius is already with Aristogeiton, and so Phetelos is feeling all jaded, and he basically bans their sister from the Pan-Athenaic festival. And this is like a huge slight. The fact that their sister gets banned, that's like a real offense to their family. And so what Harmodius and Aristogeiton end up doing is trying to kill Hippias and Hipparchus as a way to get back at the kind of tyrant's family. Now, the thing is, it doesn't work. They're able to kill Hipparchus, but they can't kill Hippias. And Harmodius is killed on the spot, while Aristogeiton is captured and then tortured to death. Not a great way to go. But what ends up happening later on is the two Tyrannicides are remembered within ancient Greek society as being these very, very noble people. So their descendants, much later on, are basically like treated like heroes in Greek society. So they're fed at the public expense. There are songs sung about these guys. They have graves that are set up that are worshipped later on. Now, Hippias is still around, and this is where we kind of take the next step towards democracy. Now, what Hippias ends up doing is he ends up kicking out a bunch of the leading families from the city of Athens, right? He doesn't want another assassination attempt, so he's taking all those other rich families, kicking them out of town. And one of those families was the Alcmaeonids, right? This goes all the way back over 100 years to that coup of CYLON. And the Alcmaeonids get kicked out. Hippias says, hey, remember that curse? You're not supposed to be in Athens anyway. So he kicks them out, and they go down to the Delphic Oracle, right? So the site of Delphi, the Temple of Apollo, and they bribe the Oracle of Delphi to say that anytime anybody comes to the Delphic Oracle looking for an answer to some question, the first words the Delphic Oracle should pronounce are "First free Athens," right? With the idea that you're freeing them from the tyrant Hippias. So the Alcmaeonids are down here bribing the Delphic Oracle to say this, and one of those guys is a guy by the name of CLEISTHENES, and he's going to become the pivotal character in the foundation of the lasting Greek democracy, right? The one that really catches on. Now, so we have CLEISTHENES over here, and then we have this Spartan dude, CLEOMENES, over on this side. And CLEOMENES was up there, and remember Sparta, right around 500 BC, is kind of at peak power within ancient Greece. They're really the head of the Peloponnese, they're the head of the Peloponnesian League, and they're trying to take over Athens, which is starting to grow in power. And they want to know how to do that. So CLEOMENES goes to the Oracle at Delphi, and the Delphic Oracle says, hey, first free Athens, right, from this tyrant, and then you can kind of have more power over the government that's set up afterwards. And so CLEOMENES teams up with CLEISTHENES, and they go through, and they're able to kick out the tyrant Hippias, and CLEISTHENES starts his governmental reforms. Now, What are those governmental reforms? Well, Cleisthenes puts together something that looks a lot like what Solon had earlier. So the first thing he does is he divides up Athenian territory into 30 what we call trities, all right? And these are different land divisions, and there are three kind of categories. There's coastal ones, there's ones in the cities, right, in the urban areas, and then there's rural ones, right? So different parts of Athenian territory near the coast, in the countryside, and in the city itself. And out of those areas, he makes 10 new tribes. And each tribe has one part coastal, one part rural, one part urban unit. And so they end up kind of very diverse. And these tribes become the different voting units of Athenian democracy. The next thing that he ends up doing is he ends up reinstituting this council. Now it's a council of 500. And what we end up seeing here is that there are 50 men from each of the 10 tribes who participate each year. They can only serve twice, and they only serve one-year terms. And so what this means, right, because of the large number of men and the short time where they actually serve, is that nearly every Athenian citizen, right, adult male citizen, would serve on this council at some point in time in their lives. Now, every day, there's a different president chosen from the council. And the president's the guy who presides over the council and leads their decision-making process. Now, what the council actually ends up doing is what we call setting the agenda. And that sounds really boring, right? Setting the agenda. But basically, they're deciding what to vote on, things about whether to go to war, right? Things about whether somebody should live or die, things about different laws, and anything like that. The council is deciding whether that gets voted upon. And then it's the people, right, who all come together and they vote on these issues. And that's where we get our term demokratia, very literally the power of the people. And so one of the cool things again here is because you get a new president of this council every day, and because so many different people serve, something like 3/4 of the Athenian population would serve as the president of this council, at least for one day in their lives, which is kind of crazy to think about, right? Think about how far that is from what we have in American democracy today. So where the power ends up coming from, it comes from the power of the people. They're the ones voting on the different issues set by the council. And so the way that you gain political power is not by running for office or anything like that. It's based on your ability to persuade the assembly, right? Persuade the people that your view is correct. And so power resides in people who are very rhetorically advanced, who can make good arguments about the way they think people should vote the way they think the world should work. Now, this is a period of turmoil as well. So Cleisthenes actually gets exiled. So one of the things is that Cleomenes, all right, doesn't really like the way that Cleisthenes is doing things. He doesn't think that this form of government is going to give Sparta enough power in Athens, so he teams up with Cleisthenes' main opponent and kicks him out of there. And the people don't like this at all. So the people then kick out the guy who just came in, and they reinstall Cleisthenes as the leader. And so sometime around 508, these different democratic reforms end up coming into play. Now, at the same time, Cleomenes is still trying to find a way to get more influence in Athens, right? So he tried by getting Cleisthenes into power, didn't really like that. He tried by installing somebody else who was not Cleisthenes, a guy by the name of Anaxagoras. That didn't work because the people kicked him out. And so now he's back down in the Peloponnese, trying to rally the Peloponnesian League to go ahead and attack Athens. And they're just about ready to do this, but then kind of Corinth, the city-state of Corinth, gets cold feet. They start thinking like, hey, maybe we don't want a tyrant in Athens, so they bail, and then everybody else starts bailing out. And Thebes, all right, up here actually, is the only city-state that actually does end up attacking. And most people think that Athens is going to get their butt kicked because Thebes was really, really powerful at the time. But somehow, Athens is able to defend the city, able to win the war. People are amazed that this new form of government was able to actually get things together so quickly to defend itself. And so Athens has now made a name with their new form of government. Now, it looks like Athenian democracy is pretty successful. And it stays in power for essentially like 2 centuries, right? Nearly 200 years in a fairly unchanged kind of form. But that doesn't mean they're out of the woods. During this kind of back and forth, right, where Cleomenes is coming up and trying to install different leaders in Athens, at some point in time, they're scared of Sparta, and some of the delegates from Athens who are out in the Near East end up going to the local Persian governor and asking this Persian governor for help in case Sparta attacks. And the Persian governor says, sure, I'll help you, right? Just give us a gift of earth and water and we'll come and defend you. And so these delegates end up giving this gift, unbeknownst to the leadership in Athens, and what they actually are doing from the Persian perspective is submitting to Persian rule. Now, it doesn't matter that Persia never actually came to help Athens at all. They didn't actually help Athens against Sparta or against Thebes or anything like that. But that doesn't matter from the Persian perspective. From their perspective, Athens has now submitted to Persia. And we will see in the years to come, following the installation of democracy in Athens, how this has some fairly kind of dire consequences and sparks one of the greatest wars the world had ever seen. So that's how we see things playing out over the next few years, right after the rise of democracy.